Puppet Master by Adobe James. DeCarlo was the last of the great puppet masters. At one time, when he was at the pinnacle of his powers and popularity, great hordes of people had come to the puppetorium from incredibly long distances to watch his 10,000 little creations perform in stirring, soul-gripping pageants of war and love. There had been wealth, fame, and companionship in those days. Now, DeCarlo had only his puppets. Occasionally, either through accident or design, someone would stray from the chartered roads and unexpectedly drop in on DeCarlo's puppetorium. But these visits were few, and most of the visitors would feel uncomfortable as they sat in the shabby seats watching DeCarlo's pathetic efforts to put on a special performance for them. It was really sad, they all agreed, through inactivity. DeCarlo no longer had complete control of the puppets. Fully half of the machinery was out of order, and, worst of all, the antiquated performance was boring. No, obviously, DeCarlo's days of glory had withered. Today, only the chill winds of decay blew through the barren arbours of greatness. None of this mattered to DeCarlo, though, for the puppet master was engrossed in making plans for a comeback. He had begun to create a new entire series of puppets, a different puppet, one which would make him famous again. He thought the new ones were beautiful, the best thing he had ever done. And yet, his old fans, the ones who had known DeCarlo at his height of glory, would have been appalled. In truth, the puppets were grotesque. The little people, the birds, the animals, the monsters, the scenery were all alien in appearance, quite unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. They all reflected his aging eyesight, his trembling hands, his approaching senility, and his loneliness. DeCarlo saw none of these faults. He thought of them as being near perfection. He had developed a strong rapport with some of the new puppets, one of them especially. Her name was Lilith. She was the most beautiful, as well as being the most animated and the most affectionate. Often, when he was holding her, Lilith would impulsively lean forward, seemingly of her own accord, and kiss his cheek. He had created her out of a piece of cloth from his own vest. He had given her eyes to see with, lips and mouth to smile and sing with, and a nose and ears and arms and hands, and a perfect little body. Oh, she was beauty. When DeCarlo stood in that black formless limbo behind the curtains, towering above the darkened stage, he sometimes thought he could feel her little heart beating in happy anticipation. You see, he loved Lilith, and Lilith loved him. Of course, the rest of the puppets loved DeCarlo too, but not in the same way. He was a father to them. Sometimes, like naughty children, they sassed and would not obey. Afterwards, though, the puppets were always contrite and, shamefaced, would apologize and beg forgiveness. They had learned their lesson well, he thought, as a result of the earlier punishment of Asmodeus. The puppet, Asmodeus, had been disrespectful, disobedient, had continually refused to obey the commands. So, one day, with all the other puppets lined up on parade, their bright eyes unblinking and unfathomable as they watched, DeCarlo had doused the screaming and suddenly repentant Asmodeus in oil and set him afire. Lilith had understood the necessity of the cruel punishment. The other puppets did not. Since that time, it seemed as if the others no longer cared for the puppet master as a friend. They spoke to him as if he were an angry god or a harsh father. Without their friendship, their childlike playfulness, De Carlo found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his work. Much of the earlier inspiration was gone. The colours of his stage settings seemed to fade, become drab, until they were merely a cacophony of dullness instead of a symphony of beauty. The dismal fogs of loneliness and despair closed in around him more often. He began to lament the famous days when he had the companionship of his own kind, and there were moments of painful insight when he realized he was, in fact, only a lonely old man playing with dolls. "Soon I shall die," De Carlo told the puppet Lilith. "Oh, my poor, poor darling," Lilith replied softly. She laid her head against his collarbone. "Don't be sad, I love you." Awkwardly, De Carlo petted her. "Thank you, little one." His voice rumbled like thunder ringing in the canyons of the sky, and his great, grateful tears ran like rivers flowing from the glaciated snowpacks of his eyes. There was a moment of silence, finally broken by Lilith, who said, "I know, let's go out to the garden theatre, and there I will dance for you." "The garden?" "Oh yes, please." Her blue eyes twinkled happily, and the little skirt swirled around as she pirouetted to show her joy. "Please." "All right," De Carlo grumbled, reluctantly being drawn into the warm whirlpool of her enthusiasm. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." She kissed his cheek again. "You're so good to me." "Hold on tight then." Lilith giggled and clutched his coat. They moved out onto the platform and down into the garden theatre. This had been the setting for one of De Carlo's most famous plays. It was a lush, verdant, pastoral scene, with miniature fruit trees and a tiny stream that flowed like liquid crystal across the land. De Carlo had manufactured small birds and animals for the setting. The birds now chirped and sang softly, while little animals twitched their noses and scampered away in mock fright at their approach. A male puppet, one of the caretaker gardeners, was using a knife to trim back some plants. "You may go." De Carlo dismissed him. The puppet inclined his head respectfully and backed away. De Carlo placed Lilith alongside an oak tree. Then, being careful not to crush part of the scenery, he sat down in front of her. Laughing, she ran over and placed her head against his hand. The smell of an afternoon rain came to them, and, along with it, the smell of new and eager, young, growing things, and decaying, dying, old things. "How peaceful it is," De Carlo said, feeling himself becoming melancholy. "Don't be sad," Lilith crooned. "Be happy with me. Think happy thoughts for me." He smiled down, pleased with the concern in her voice. "Very well, happy thoughts. Like the time the king came on my stage, right here, with tears in his eyes, and said I was the world's greatest artist. Happy thoughts. Like love fondly recalled. And many friends, more friends than one could ever hope to count. And summer nights, when one is young and there are no aches. And people of your own kind to talk to." "Yes, yes," she clapped. "Things like that. Aren't you happy right now?" De Carlo thought for a moment. Finally he answered, without conviction, "I suppose I am." His voice lowered and became forlorn. "But I would be happier if the rest of the puppets loved me as you do." Lilith angrily stamped her little foot. "They're fools, De Carlo, jealous, stupid, insensitive, unappreciative fools. They're only little machines. Beasts, really. But I am part of you. I was your first new creation. The rest of them don't matter. Once again she attempted to put her arms around him. Please, let me dance for you. He forced a smile. Go ahead, little one. Slowly, never taking her eyes from him, Lilith began dancing. She was tantalizing. She was beauty, poetry in motion. She was woman. She swayed to and fro like a young sapling in gentle winds. Her arms moved up and down like white wings of a bird in slow flight, and her hair swept from side to side like a restless golden sea. DiCarlo, completely hypnotized, as always, watched her graceful dance. She reminded him of someone who had loved him once. Who? The name was almost in his mind when he was yanked back to reality by the repeated tugging on his coat. He looked down and saw the female puppet he had made to be a servant of the gardener. She called his name. Yes. His voice was filled with exasperation at being interrupted. DiCarlo, you promised me clothes, but I have none. She gazed down at her thick, ungraceful, mud-stained, nude body. Go away, I'll make your garments later, in time for the show at least. But you've dressed her. She nodded angrily towards Lilith. Why do you not treat me as you do her? Why is she your favourite? I told you to go away. Are you going to be disobedient? There was an implied warning in the question. The female turned her gaze from him, but the puppet master had seen her long enough to know that she was weeping when she disappeared into the bushes. Soon DiCarlo was lost again in the trance created by Lilith's dance. Perhaps it was this trance, perhaps it was that foggy moment when the soul is called elsewhere, or perhaps he saw the approaching danger and it simply did not register in his brain. Whatever the reason, he was quite unprepared for what happened next. His mind returned when Lilith screamed. He saw her cowering with her back pressed tight against a fruit tree. Her eyes were wide in silent exorcism. It was then, and only then, that DiCarlo saw the gardener. His voice thundered the command, You, puppet, go away, get back! The dark-haired male paid no attention. It was almost as if his ears had been deafened by desire. He crept forward, on all fours like an anxious dog, past the little waterfall, past the frightening mountain that was DiCarlo's leg, past the bridge, and then reached the trees where he stood, looking down at Lilith, his hands clenched and unclenched in lust. Guttural, animal-like sounds were coming from his throat. He reached out and caressed her bare thigh. Lilith shuddered at his touch. Puppet, DiCarlo shouted, I will destroy you if you go one step farther. The admonition had no effect on the gardener. Lilith attempted to scramble back away from him. She was helpless in her fright. Her legs were awkward, unmanageable. She tripped and fell. The male immediately pounced on her. Stop it! Stop! DiCarlo screamed. What was happening? What was going wrong with the puppet? It was all a disjointed dream. It had to be a dream. A nightmare. The male had ripped off Lilith's undergarments. He savagely slapped her when she struggled. He was invincible, a superman, and DiCarlo was impotent. Help me, DiCarlo, Lilith cried. Now she was flat on her back, eyes frozen in disbelief. DiCarlo watched, horrified, so stunned that he was incapable of movement. He saw the male. He saw the terrible, wicked thing that the male was about to do. a forbidden thing. He saw and heard Lilith scream as the insertion was made. Saw the male's body arched and moving in passion, and then, as nightmare piled on nightmare, saw the gardener's knife suddenly materialize in Lilith's hands. She stabbed at the male's back, but the knife slipped over the shoulder, inflicting only a small, superficial wound on the tanned skin. It was painful, though. The puppet roared like some wild, wounded beast, and twisted the knife from her. His arm rose once, twice. The blade sank deep into her throat, and the blood stained her blouse, and her little eyes closed. Once, just before she died, DiCarlo thought he heard Lilith's voice calling out to him, like the far-off cry of a night bird. The gardener stood and shook his head. His bull-like neck twisted contemptuously towards DiCarlo, and then he started to leave. "You should not have done that." DiCarlo's voice was troubled, sad, full of fatherly love. The puppet looked up and flung a curse. "Lilith was mine. You knew she was mine. What you did was forbidden. Now, I am forced to punish you," the puppet master intoned. He watched the still arrogant, but now uncertain, expression on the gardener's face. The puppet master reached out. The male threw up his hands and screamed rebelliously as DiCarlo closed his fist and slowly began squeezing. Then the puppet was struggling. Sharp teeth bit into DiCarlo's hand, and the puppet master was forced to release his hold. Oh, the impertinence of the puppet! It was unbelievable. The more he fought, the angrier DiCarlo became. The battle raged across the grassy plain. The gardener, unbending, began shouting curses and taunts. He fell once and momentarily was at the mercy of the puppet master. But as DiCarlo's huge foot came crashing down from the heavens to stamp out life, the male rolled aside. Finally, he sought refuge behind a fruit tree. DiCarlo plucked the tree from the ground and, abruptly, saw the battle was over. The male was winded. His strength was gone. The little figure stood, panting, waiting, waiting, waiting. "Are you sorry?" DiCarlo asked, wanting, needing some sign of repentance. The puppet spat. DiCarlo's voice was as thunder, and the soft little clouds, part of the setting, scuttled away from the force of his breath. The musical, living sounds of the garden abruptly died, and there was a vast silence upon the land. No bird sang, no animal moved. "Very well then, you pay for your transgressions, evil one. What I created, I now destroy as a lesson to all of those like you who would mutilate beauty, who would rape, who would take that which has been denied them." DiCarlo lifted his foot once again. The male puppet stood, panting, looking up, unremorseful and defiant and unafraid, as the huge figure blotted out his sun and sky. "DiCarlo!" The whining, discordant voice of the female reached him. He peered down angrily and saw her grotesque figure, standing atop a small rise next to his leg. In her hand she carried the gardener's knife, Lilith's murder weapon. "Give me the knife," DiCarlo commanded. "I will destroy him with his own instrument of hate." "Please, DiCarlo." "Master." Don't kill him!" It was a plea from the ugly, mud-spattered woman. The sight of her sickened De Carlo. Lilith had been right. These were beasts, animals, and he would never understand how he could have thought of them as beautiful or near perfection. "Give me the knife, or do you wish punishment also?" The female stood looking up at him, blinking back tears and sniffling like a frightened but adamant small child. Finally, her spirit apparently broken, she began walking dejectedly towards De Carlo. Her hands hung limply at her side. "The knife," De Carlo demanded again. She closed her eyes. Her little body shuddered once or twice as she reached some sudden decision, and then, abruptly, she was running towards the puppet master's leg. The knife blade flickered in the fading light of the late afternoon, and De Carlo felt the blade as she slashed his tendons. He shouted and hopped on one leg. Almost faster than his eyes could adjust to it, she ran and slashed at his other leg. Oh, the pain of it all! The excruciating pain! He could stand upright no longer. De Carlo screamed and fell forward to his knees, and then, slowly, like some huge, reluctant tree being toppled, continued to fall until he was helpless on his side. In his falling, he wiped out a small village, a snow-capped mountain, and created a deep crater on the plains. The female clambered up onto his chest, and the knife flashed and swung like a maddened scimitar of death as she hacked her way through the mammoth ribcage, into the cavernous chest, and then into his heart. De Carlo's legs and feet pounded the ground, raising mammoth new mountain chains, whose jagged peaks almost punctured the sun. His arms toppled whole forests of trees, and his body, convulsing in death throes, levelled fountains and gardens and buildings and machinery. His fingers scraping the earth, gouged huge riverbeds and crevices and canyons. The gushers of blood from his open heart pumped high into the air, and the afternoon was filled with red rain. And finally, he lay still on his side, looking through rapidly dimming old eyes at the two mutinous puppets. He made one feeble attempt to raise his hand and smash them, but his strength was gone. He dropped his arm and closed his eyes. The female puppet ran swiftly across the broken, maimed earth and reached the side of the male. The ground shuddered fearfully, and trees swayed in the hurricane winds from each dying gasp of the puppet master. The sky was darkening. Broken machinery made wild, insane noises and movements. The earth opened and closed like a hungry sea anemone. Plants sprouted, bloomed, withered, and died in split seconds. A maddened moon and sun chased each other from horizon to horizon, and seas peeled back and raised and crashed inward. The two puppets stared at each other, frightened beyond speech, almost incapable of movement, and then, terrified at what they had done and what was happening, clasped each other's hand and began running towards the west, away from the verdant cage the puppet master had called Eden.